Good evening. Welcome to Taking Stock here on ENCA. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight, South Africa's personal debt crisis. We know that the country has got a debt burden, an enormous debt burden that takes up 21 cents out of every rand that government collects. But when it comes to our personal finances, are we any better off? We'll find out the extent of the bad debt problem as debt collectors are struggling with an idea proposed by the Trade and Industry Minister, Ebrahim Patel, that we don't blacklist anybody for the COVID period, simply because people have lost jobs and their finances are out of control. We'll also look at the depth of the personal financial crisis and wrap it up this evening with Maya Fischer-French, familiar to you, the host of Money Matters, as she looks at South Africans who actually are better off in this crisis. That's all coming up on this edition of Taking Stock. Well, up first this evening on Taking Stock is Advocate Andries Cornelius, who is Chief Executive of the Council for Debt Collectors. Andries, just give me a picture, if you would, as to how serious the situation is in South Africa in terms of this rising mountain of bad debt that is creeping up and up and up.
Good evening, Bruce, and thanks for inviting me. I think when you start talking about bad debts, the new figures are only coming out now, so that we can see what sort of impact COVID has really had. You know, even before COVID struck us, we were already sitting at about 1.9 trillion rand in total debt. Nearly 900 billion of that is cars and houses and things, so it's not really that relevant sort of debt. But 240 billion of that was unsecured credit. And unsecured credit is what people use, one would think, to buy luxuries. But in South Africa, that's not the case. They use unsecured credit to buy food, to pay hospital bills, things like that. And there will probably be, due to COVID, a massive spike in the amount of unsecured credit, because when we started with the lockdown in March, government was already urging the credit providers to provide credit because they knew that people were going to need credit. So we will have to wait till those figures come out exactly by how much it had climbed and what the appetite was for credit providers to give more credit during these times.
But we've got a fairly good indication. We've seen updates from African Bank. We've seen Capitex trading updates, and these are big players in that space. Standard Bank recently had a trading update. The rest of the banking sector is warning us that their claims experience is deteriorating. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. Early indications are of a spike in joblessness. And this is, unfortunately, in a market where people are more likely to be taking short-term loans out, the unsecured loans, those loans that attract higher interest rates for short periods of time. But if you have to start extending those loans over longer periods and still charging interest rates, this is interest on interest on interest, people are getting themselves into all kinds of trouble.
No, for sure. And especially if you look at what happened in the beginning of the lockdown, credit providers were still allowed to operate. They were considered essential services, but debt collection was not. So you had a 2-month period where people were or credit providers were getting credit, but they weren't getting any of those bad debts in. And, you know, any economic system works on the principle, if you borrow somebody money, there's got to be a way to recover it from those people who are not paying. But due to people's changes in circumstances, either to losing their jobs or taking pay cuts, obviously become much more difficult for people to service their debts. And that will probably remain so for the foreseeable future, at least for the rest of this year, it looks like.
And so what do you then make of Ebrahim Patel's suggestion that we should just abandon blacklisting for now? Because there are a couple of tools that debt collectors have got in their arsenal. The most drastic of that is blacklisting, and that means that people can't get a loan in the formal sector at all until they clear their records. It's quite a dramatic proposal, particularly under current circumstances where there is this rising tide of indebtedness.
No, for sure. Look, I think it's a catch-22, because on the one side, you want people to get credit, and you want credit providers to provide them with that credit. But credit providers need tools to see whether or not, when they give somebody credit, that it doesn't become reckless lending. And they normally do that, or not normally, they always do that by looking at somebody's credit profile, looking at the credit bureau. Is this a person who has been paying his debt? You know, more than 40% of South Africans have some sort of adverse listing on the credit bureaus in any event. But if you can no longer use the credit bureaus to determine whether or not somebody can repay what you give him, then you might get into trouble later on with the national credit regulator when he says, this is reckless credit that you've extended, and therefore you can't recover it. So it's a bit of a catch-22.
And then the risk, of course, is the formal sector then tightens up to a point where they then stop lending as much as they've been lending, and you don't get that stimulus coming into the economy. People don't have access to credit, and that then really hurts people who may be dependent on credit, particularly if they are looking for a job, out of a job, or trying to service old debts, for example.
Absolutely, and the wrong thing that what happens then, if you can no longer get access to the formal credit market, your only option is to get credit to the informal market. And once you start doing that, all the rules, all the interest rates are out the window, and you once again start looking at 200-300% interest in informal microlenders that are not registered, which is even worse news for consumers already in a difficult financial position. So you want to enable them to get access to formal credit so that they can be bound, or the credit provider can be bound by the NCR rules and regulations. You don't want to drive them into the informal credit market if you can help it at all.
So do you see a way of navigating through this? Because we've got credit providers who are getting really nervous about the state of their customers. You've got customers who are nervous about the state of their jobs and their ability to earn money to pay back their debts. And you've got a government which wants lenders to expand their loan portfolios at the same time as protect consumers, even not from the voracious appetites of money lenders, but just to try and protect their potential voters. They want to protect consumers from the worst effects of failing to pay back those debts.
I must tell you, I personally can't see any way out of this unless there's a compromise. Both sides have to compromise. On the one side, the government will have to realize the debts has to be recovered. And if all the COVID relief I look at, most of them are loans in any event. They're going to have to be repaid at some stage. But for people who can't afford it, they've lost their jobs, there has to also be some sort of a safety net or mechanism. And if that means that credit providers are going to have to seriously look at interest, and what do we do with the next 12 months, or if it takes that long, or if it's even longer, what do they do with interest? Is it really that vital to keep on charging the interest for somebody who at this stage cannot pay his debts? I mean, it makes no sense. You're only putting him in a position where he'll never be able to pay his debts. And that is also not something you want. You want people to pay their debts so that they can access the market again and get credit when they require it, need it.
Do you see an early 2000s type of risk? I mean, where there'd been so much reckless lending. This is the days before the National Credit Regulator. It's an awfully long time ago. I only just remember it, but I'm sure you remember it with a particular with a particular concern, where we had lots of lenders going bust as a result of the failure of their borrowers to pay them back. I'm not sure if we're there yet, but is there that risk?
I'm sure the risk is there, although we've had experience in the last couple of years in the way in which the credit market has been going. And most of the big providers in any event has surely penciled it in as a risk and taken steps to make sure it doesn't happen. Obviously not in this scale that we are in now. But I think if you look at the different financial institutions and the way their debt is made up and the books is made up, they should be able to weather the storm, depending on how long it takes, obviously. I mean, if this is a 2-3 year process, then we might have the same discussion in 2 or 3 years without any credit providers. But I personally can't see it coming to that.
Good news indeed on that particular point, but yeah, tough times. Andries Cornelius, thank you very much indeed, Chief Executive of the South African Council for Debt Collectors. In a moment, we'll speak to a researcher at TransUnion, the sort of state that consumers are getting themselves into, and we are seeing good research being done into that space. That's coming up in a moment. Well, on to part two of Taking Stock this evening, and we're talking to Carmen Williams. Now, Carmen is the head of research and consulting at TransUnion, and you've done the latest in your annual hardship surveys, Carmen. Just how much tougher are things this year than in previous years?
Indeed, thanks so much, Bruce. Just to give you a little bit of context, TransUnion has been conducting these regular surveys to understand the impact that COVID-19 has had on consumer finances. So what we've seen is that about 80% of consumers have been negatively impacted, and it's been hovering around the 80% mark since the inception of the survey, which began in April. So we've been doing this on a monthly basis since April to get a sense of how consumers are feeling. What does stand out really, Bruce, is the fact that about 17% of consumers report that they have lost their jobs as a result of this pandemic. Now, this has increased substantially since April, up by 7 percentage points. So initially it was 10% of consumers, so 1 in 10. That has now increased to 1 in 6 of consumers reporting that they have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic.
I mean, it's absolutely frightening, isn't it, Carmen? I mean, this sudden stop, this real heart attack in the economy. And it was terrifying in April. And then what we've seen since then, there was the sudden stop, and then we've had people slowly going back to work. But as companies go back to work, they kind of go, all right, we need to do with 10, 15, 20% fewer people. And this is where we start seeing people affected. And we're not through the worst of it yet, I don't think. I mean, certainly expectations are for more job losses as the year progresses.
Indeed. Also, what we've seen in our research to date, around 39% of consumers report having their work hours reduced. And as you rightly mentioned, even though lockdown has been easing, businesses have had to take a stance in terms of what they can absolutely afford to operate with, given the current circumstances from a resource perspective, indeed.
And so as we look at it, Carmen, I mean, as we look at the environment in which we operate, we look at the scenarios that we face, even consumers who have jobs and know that they're likely to have jobs for the next 3, 6, 12 months ahead, they're spending differently. They're borrowing differently. They are behaving differently financially.
Absolutely. In fact, of those consumers who report being financially impacted, 91% indicate that they are concerned about their future ability to pay their bills. What's interesting is that in previous waves, rent and utilities were the top 2 concerns. But more recently, we've seen that change, and the top 2 concerns are now retail and clothing accounts, as well as personal loan accounts. And the fact that a large majority of payment holidays do see an end at the end of June, this is no surprise as consumers try and understand how they make these payments going forward once those accommodations end.
And when you look at the trends, I mean, is there any sense that people are beginning to see an improvement? Or is there any level of confidence returning a little bit, at least as the economy opens up and gives more options for people? Or is it all just downward doom and gloom and people feeling really frightened about the future?
Well, since April, we've seen this financially impacted number hover around the 80% mark. When we started in April, that was 79%. It went to a high of 84% last month, and this month it's now at 80%. So generally, the sentiment seems to be the same. Improving somewhat with the lockdown levels easing, but that 91% of people who are concerned about paying their bills has remained consistent since inception.
Carmen Williams, thank you very much. Carmen is with TransUnion. She is the head of research at TransUnion. Some terrifying statistics there as to how you've been impacted. The vast majority of us as South Africans being impacted. We're not alone, though. The world is a deeply unsettled and uncertain place. The furlough schemes in the United Kingdom, the support that many governments have been able to give their citizens is beginning to run out. And maybe that is what creates the creative stimulus into the future. I don't know. Let's talk to Maya Fischer-French next. She is the head of Maya on Money and no stranger to your screens in a moment. Well, you're very familiar with Maya Fischer-French. You see her on your screens on a regular basis talking about money and personal finance. We've had a fairly depressing assessment of the state of South Africa's mass market, with 80% of South Africans reporting some kind of financial deterioration. But Maya Fischer-French, who is the editor at mayaonmoney.co.za, there is 20% of the South African economy, possibly a bit less, but people are actually seeing cash flows improve. People aren't spending as much on impulse shopping and buying stuff, and going out to restaurants and being adventurous with their money. They're being quite conservative.
You know, Bruce, that's been so interesting to me, is that obviously I'm getting those people who are saying, I've been retrenched, what do I do? But I'm actually getting quite a lot of people saying, you know what, I suddenly discovered in lockdown extra money at the end of the month because it wasn't eating out, it wasn't the impulse shopping and all those other things. And I've used this too, and generally speaking, they've used it to pay off debt. So we've seen a lot of store cards being closed, credit cards being shut down, and people saying, where do I invest? Where do I start putting my money? And that's been quite an interesting change for me. So there is definitely some money around, and I'm not dismissing those many people who are struggling. But the reality is we are seeing some people with cash flush. And Bruce, the other interesting one is when I start speaking to people who are in the renovation business. I was speaking to a woman who owns a bathroom business, and she said, I'm having my best month ever. And it feels like maybe people have been stuck in these four walls. Interest rates are dropping, their bond repayments are lowering, and they're saying, finally, I'm going to go and get around to fixing up my bathroom or doing something. So I think we're seeing two economies at the moment. And the question is, how long can the healthier side of the economy continue if the weak part just keeps falling? And I think that's the question everyone's asking, is that this bit of cash flush we have at the moment, for how long?
And that's the thing. And also, I mean, if we can focus on the opportunity that this provides us, though, because I think we've all learned what happened in lockdown is how much we wanted versus how much we needed. And financial advisors, people like you, financial journalists, people who talk about personal finance all the time, always tell us that, you know, we have to be responsible. We have to make a list of all of our expenditure and then split out what we need and want and then only go for what we need in tough times. Well, it's now been forced upon us. And the one thing that it's done is it's actually proven to us what is possible when we can't spend. So why should that not fundamentally change our money habits for the long term? It's a good opportunity to refocus, perhaps.
I think that's definitely what we're seeing. We're seeing people suddenly realizing, oh, wow, you know what? And I'm seeing, especially women, Bruce, as we do like our clothes. And I've been speaking to some work colleagues and saying, you know, I don't have to get dressed up anymore for work. I don't need that new jacket. And I actually don't have to keep spending all that money. Now, of course, what happens when you all go back into the workplace? Maybe those behaviors will change. But what I'm really hoping to see is that at least people have paid off some debts. So that is already freeing up some cash for them. And of course, if you start taking out that debit order that we keep telling everyone to do, to start investing, it's unlikely you're going to cancel it. So if you can kind of now get that lazy money, that money you're not spending, quickly allocated either to debt repayments, emergency funds, or investing, then it's going to be hard for you to kind of go back and unwind those good habits. So it's a lot like, it's kind of committing your future self to behaving itself by setting up the structures now so that you don't actually have any spare cash anymore when you want to go and splurge again. But of course, Bruce, credit is always available. So my other real big recommendation is go and lower, if not close your credit card, at least lower the limit. So maybe like a really low limit that you know that you can fund monthly and doesn't land you up paying it off for the next couple of years.
But it's the ultimate financial spring clean opportunity, because for people who have had these constraints forced upon them, suddenly realizing the wants versus needs, the fact that they, even if they wanted to, they're not legally anyway, go buy wine or cigarettes or whatever bad habits they've got, they've been substantially constrained there. And it's about relearning responsibility around money, and it's about reforming that relationship with money once again, because frankly, in good times, that relationship it's one of the first that goes out of the window. We spend with gay abandon that, yes, it will roll over our credit card, or we take out a short-term loan to fund a holiday or fund whatever short-term desires we might have. Does history teach us that we learn from crises like this, or do we go straight back to our bad habits when things do improve eventually?
I think what we are fundamentally optimistic. And that leads, unfortunately, sometimes to those splurges. So we always think that when you buy something on credit, our future self's paying for it because something's going to happen. Some miracle will happen and that isn't there now. And I think the optimism is kind of quite low at the moment. And Bruce, what was so interesting, I don't know if you saw some of the stats come through from the Old Mutual Savings Investment Monitor, but one of the graphs that the economist showed there was that real salary increases have been declining for 4 years before COVID. So before lockdown, we kept saying it feels tighter, it feels harder to come out every month. Yes, actually, it is true. We were getting poorer for the last 4 years. So what we were doing was we were just keeping up the lifestyle with the credit, which is why we see in the credit numbers we are in this decimation really, because ultimately we were living beyond our means for the last 4 years. In order to keep the lifestyle we had 5 years ago, we literally took on credit. And I think that realization is coming in, but also why were we living beyond our means? Because we didn't want our friends to know that we couldn't still afford the car, the clothes, the food, the wine. Now we can all blame COVID and lockdown because of lockdown. So I've got a point of reference to blame. So I don't have to put myself on Instagram looking flashy, because actually that would be very inappropriate right now, okay, when there are people suffering. So maybe now is the time to be bare your soul. I'm on a budget. I'm on a COVID budget. And maybe that's going to allow us to change our behavior. But Bruce, I don't believe it'll last forever, because as I said, humans like to spend, and we tend to be more optimistic about our future prospects, which is not a bad thing. Otherwise we'll all be miserable. But I do think right now we are going to see for a period of time a big spending shift and more honest conversations coming forward.
That's not a bad thing. I mean, next year's World Economic Forum gathering, however that works, I guess it'll be very virtual, and the village of Davos in Switzerland will be a very lonely and empty place, and affordable for once for those who can get there. But Davos, they're calling it the Great Reset, and they're talking about this from a macroeconomic perspective. From a household perspective, this 2020, 2021 should be the generation of the Great Reset. We rethink what we earn, how we earn it, and how we apportion that money, because we now have lived through the biggest financial crisis in nearly a century, and we're going through that financial crisis. And you know what? It could happen again in the future. It's time to start thinking about the boring stuff like budgets and emergency funds and all of those things that perhaps we've been able to ignore up until now.
You know, Bruce, I also think that we all in it together at the same time. But I can tell you that over your lifetime, there are going to be multiple crises. They won't all be national or global. It'll just be personal. I'm sure if you and I sat down and share our war stories, I've been through my own personal crises where I had to reset and do a proper reset. And that reset 15 years ago, how old my son now, 16 years ago, actually positioned me really well for COVID. I had my emergency funds. I didn't have debt. Had this had happened to me 16 years ago, very different story. So I think we're always going to have these moments of reset. It just happens that we're all having it at the same time. And if I have to say anything that I've learned from my own personal reset, it was that when you take action and when you put these things in place, you come out the other side. If you don't, and you put your head in the sand, that hole's going to get deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's really the only advice I can give out there. If you are in a bad situation right now, start taking action. Don't blame everybody else. Sit down and actually figure it out. And Bruce, just one other big reset button that I think we're going to be having to really talk about a lot more are the side hustles. Additional income. I'm seeing that coming through massively. And I'll use an example of my neighbor a couple of streets up. Her husband lost his income during lockdown, and she started baking sourdough bread. And she sent a message WhatsApp to us all because we're in lockdown. Fresh bread, fantastic. We were all bought in. She's now running a business that does more than 20,000 Rand turnover a month from that. So people are going to find ways to generate extra income. And this idea of an employer salary, I think those days we saw that for 4 years our incomes have been decreasing. So either we keep cutting our spending or we're going to have to find other ways to make an income. So I think that's also going to be part of the rethink going forward.
Maya Fischer-French, thank you very much indeed. Maya is an author of several books. She is also the editor of Maya on Money and the host of Money Matters here on ENCA. My thanks to Maya Fischer-French and our other guests this evening, giving us a perspective tonight on the extent of South Africa's personal financial crisis. Opportunity for a great reset for those with resources, a time of deep concern for those who don't. That's it from the show for this evening. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, bye-bye.